Now we will discuss parameter setting. Parameters is a framework within generative linguistics in which the syntax of a natural language is described in accordance with general principles as well as the parameters. The concept of principles and parameters are introduced by Noam Chomsky, especially in universal grammar and the generative concept of generative grammar, which deals with the idea that with the help of a finite number of grammatical rules, infinite number of expressions can be created. So the principles and parameters are the concepts introduced by Noam Chomsky. When we are dealing with the principles, that means principles are universal and they are applicable to all human languages. Parameters are specific and they are according to the language input that is received from the environment. In order to understand what we mean by principles and parameters, Vivian Cook has given a particular analogy, which is driving of a car. So to drive a car, the driver has to decide or choose one side of the road. That is universal. He or she has to decide which side of the road he or she is using for driving. Now, it does not say which side, but the driver has to choose. Then we have the parameter situation where, for example, in UK, a driver chooses or uses left side of the road for driving. In States, the driver uses right side of the road for driving. So, driving for choosing one side is universal. The driver has to choose or take one side for driving. This is universal. But parameters vary in terms of different countries or in terms of different nations. So for driving, you have UK where you have left-hand drive, and then you have States where you have right-hand drive. So parameters vary according to situations, according to different languages and different inputs. But then principles are universals. So now we will look at the parameter setting with regard to this particular understanding of the linguistic rules or generative linguistics rule. According to Chomsky, children are born with the knowledge of parameters and their possible settings. The task of acquiring language is therefore reduced to identifying which parameter setting apply to one's native language. One parameter is called the head parameter and has been discussed by Vivian Cook in 1988. Each phrase in the language has one element that is most essential, which is called the head. It is the noun in the noun phrase and the verb in the verb phrase. The head parameter specifies the position of the head within the phrase. In English noun phrase, the head noun comes first. For example, the man goes to bar. Now in this sentence, the head, the man, appears to the left of the phrase, and once we know that English is the head first language, we know that this principle applies to all of the types of phrases in the language. Now in contrast, in Japanese, the heads appear last rather than first. Now this is a general characteristic for Japanese. For example, Japanese has postpositions rather than prepositions. Another parameter is the null subject parameter. It is grammatically acceptable in language such as Italian and Spanish to drop the subject of a sentence. In other languages such as English, this is not permitted. This parameter then has two values, subject and null subject, as proposed by Hines. Here you see the pro-drop parameters. that are being used. This, in the case of English, is not permissible. Himes assumes that as children are exposed to examples of well-formed English sentences, they adjust this parameter to the subject setting. An alternative interpretation of these sentences, which is play it or eating cereal, is that young children have difficulty producing complete sentences. Now, Bloom argues that children omit all constituents, not just subjects. In addition, he found that children were more likely to have shorter verb phrases when they include subjects in their utterances than when they do not. This suggests that children have difficulty expressing all of the elements of their sentences, and so these elements compete for limited processing capacity. Himes' view has also been criticized by Valian. He contends that children begin with both values of the null subject parameter. However, despite these criticisms, the general class of parameter setting models proposed by Himes remains attractive because parameters address a fundamental aspect of the acquisition process, which is that children rapidly acquire their native language despite differences between languages. To sum up, the bioprogram may be thought of as a specific instance of the general concept of parameter setting. Some evidence has been presented that child learners have initial preferences in the parameter setting, although this point has been disputed.